Cool. All right. So we have done the exam marking process. I'm taking this off. The next thing on our webinar series is talking about the CPR process. There's actually quite a lot of other things I need to explain in that process to understand this. So just so you guys are aware, the stuff that I'm talking about now is related to my kahuyako within school role that I had at Selwyn College, formerly or also known as a COLE role, which is Community of Learners. We called it the Cellwise expert, and I did that for a couple of years. And so we're looking basically at that project there. So before I go into the memory aspect of learning, I want to actually talk about my colleagues also at Selwyn College kahuyako role, my friend Lawrence. He was looking at communication. And so this is actually really important in relation when we're starting to talk about memory and things like that. So basically he found that when he's teaching media studies, he describes this one scene in an Alfred Hitchcock movie about the flushing of a toilet, and that's the first time that you've ever seen a flush toilet on screen. That had nothing to do with anything about the assessment. It was just a fun fact, but the kids just wrote it down on everything because they thought it was important knowledge. So he's since learned that. But it just kind of goes to show the miscommunication that has occurred between him and the student. So something we have to keep in mind when we are communicating with our students is that we have a thought, and that thought explains what we meant, and we are then taking that and encoding that message to then speak to our students or speak to anyone in general. That person then is decoding that message and creating their own thoughts about that too. In an ideal situation, both of these thoughts are the same. And then we keep repeating this cycle over and over and over again, and they're going to speak too, so that way we can get the communication and information across. So if we don't do that well, then there's miscommunications, and we have to also keep in mind that our own personal thoughts, our experiences, that's going to influence how we encode and decode messages. So as being the adult in the room, it is really important that you are thinking about this to make sure our students get the full value of what you're trying to say to them. Now, on to my sort of project. I was looking at memory because memory to me was really interesting and how we're kind of getting this information across. So something to keep in mind when we're talking about how our brain is processing things is we have sensory inputs. Those are our 5 senses. And of those 5 senses, certain things grab our attention. So like, for example, I realize I'm thirsty. So I am going to drink and I'm going to taste this coffee. So stuff that actually gets my attention in my brain goes into short-term memory. Things that aren't things that I'm noticing are just going to be lost information. So like, I'm not maybe thinking about how I feel sitting on this chair. I now am because it's obviously actively attention, but maybe I forgot that. Then we have our short-term memory. And then what we want to do is we want to get this short-term memory encoded into our long-term memory so that way we have that information for when we sit the test. A big factor in whether something's going to go from short-term to long-term memory is how often we rehearse that information. So basically, how often are we going and accessing this pathway right here between short-term and long-term, short-term and long-term. So that way we build a strong pathway here so when it comes to the test, we can remember it. If we don't do that, then it's lost information. So you might find a student does really well on the day when they're learning the material, but because they haven't practiced it, they're not going to remember it for the test. And obviously with time, we're going to lose some of that information. That's why I don't remember how to do the calculus that I was taught in high school. I could do it, but now I can't. So what we call this process here is retrieval practice. And the more times we do that, the better our long-term memory gets with that information. I have simply taken that theory and gave it a nice, cute little name called CPR, which is critical practice of retrieval. The kids absolutely love the CPR because it takes away that anxiety, and it's a cute little name, and we'll make little jokes about how we're trying to revive our grades. So we'll sing, up, 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 staying alive, when we talk about our CPR test. And I'll explain what I'm doing with that CPR. So this is a accumulation of multiple bits of research that I've read online, and then I've combined it into my kahuyako project. The other thing I want to note as a good kind of idea for teachers is doing some pre-learning before you start your teaching. So this came from another friend who read the literature and found that actually if we can do some pre-learning before the teaching, it makes it easier for the teaching because you're reducing the mental load on your student if they have prior knowledge. So they've actually flipped the script, and instead of doing the SciPad pages after they do the notes, they do the SciPad pages first and then the notes. So that way they are familiar with some of the terminology before you give it to them. And I've tried that last year and found my students really liked it. So I would tell them, okay, today's lesson is just pre-learning. I want you to do these SciPad pages. I'll walk around and help you understand it. I'll give you the notes for this material tomorrow. But I want you guys to first understand what I'm going to talk about. So that way it's easier for your working memory. And I explain to my students this process as well, because I want them to understand how their brains work. Because if they understand how their brains work, then they can, again, do better on the assessment. So now on to CPR and my nice little joke. So what we need to do with CPR is we need to give them 3 attempts to do some work. I often give them an exam question for them to do as practice, and they have 3 attempts to that. The first attempt is what I want them to do is I want them to just use what is in their brain. So these CPR tasks, if I think about the sequence of when I'm doing them, we have the pre-learning SciPad. There's often just SciPad work. Or textbook work. ESA also is good too. Or any sort of worksheet, workbook that you think is got enough support that the students can work through it on their own. Then we do teaching. Then we might do some more study, depending on the time. And then we'll do our CPR tests. And actually, I call them a quiz instead of a test because that seems to reduce that anxiety. And that is an NCAA question. Or it could be a mock question, whichever one you want to use as your practice. So first attempt, they're using what is only in their brain. They do not use any notes. They do not talk to their classmates. They are trying to see what is in their long-term memory. An important part of us doing these CPR tasks is they need to color code. So either they highlight their answer, they can highlight it like that, or they can just highlight the section, or they can use a certain color pen. I used to tell them what color pencils and things to use, but they actually are better off picking their own. So that's what they do, and they try to get down as much as they can. This tells them what is in their long-term memory currently. Now, just because it's in their long-term memory doesn't mean it's right, which is why we do second attempts and third attempts. The second attempt is they can start using their notes, they can start using Google, they can start using researching, they can basically look to find the answer, but they are still working individually. They can go back and they can check their first attempt just to make sure that they have the right information, or if they've made a mistake. That is useful for them to know because then they know what is misinformation in their brain. And then everything they do on that second attempt, again, needs to be in a different color from the first attempt. So they either highlight it differently or they change the color of pen. This is actually going to be very useful at the end when they do their revision. All right, their third attempt then, this is when they can start getting help from the teacher, their friends, their classmates. Actually, let me backtrack. So this one here basically tells them, what do you know? Sorry, what do you understand, but isn't in your long-term memory? And then this last attempt then is with your, classmates, your friends, your teachers, etc. And this is a really important step when they do that third attempt, because what this tells them is what they do not understand. And then when we go back to start doing our study, we know how to prioritize our study to give us the most bang for our buck. So when students are studying, they should start with whatever has been highlighted from the third attempt or whatever the third attempt color was. That is basically telling them what they don't know. So if they want to get the best marks, they need to attack things that they are feeling the least confident with. Once they are done with that material, they then backtrack through these steps and they start going to the second attempt and seeing what they understand but isn't in their long-term memory. And then stuff actually in their first attempt, if it was right, they don't need to practice it. This, I find, is something that we really need to break our students from doing, because a lot of them want to start with what they feel confident and comfortable with because they want to feel a win. And there is going to be a time and frame when they do that. But when they are studying, that's not what they should be working on first. All right. And when we do probably the prioritizing lesson, we will talk about that. Yeah. All right, so I hope that has helped, making sure there's nothing left on my paper, but that is looking at this to-do list here that I believe is talking about everything I want to talk about when it comes to the CPR. And now the next webinar is going to be on prioritizing, which is actually quite useful because I just talked about that. So it's going to be a good transition, hopefully.